Welcome to this training video, which supports the delivery of the Year 9 Condoms and Consent unit as part of the OAT Citizenship and PSHE Education curriculum. This unit consists of 6 lessons, and although it's the first unit within the curriculum with a focus on what might traditionally be referred to as sex education, the majority of the unit focuses on healthy relationships and examples of situations which can be used to further explore healthy and unhealthy relationships. The unit also includes content about the use of condoms and the transmission of sexually transmitted infections. Before teaching this unit, it's important to ensure that all parents and carers are aware of the planned content and that they're reminded of their legal right to request withdrawal from the content which your school has deemed as sex education content within its RSE or PSHE policy. As a reminder, parents and carers may not request withdrawal from content around relationships or health. Lesson 1 begins with a draw and write task, in which pupils are asked to draw people who are in a healthy relationship. This is a deliberately vague instruction because this task also acts as a baseline, which pupils can then come back to at the end of this lesson and possibly also later in the unit. Where possible, avoid giving much in the way of instructions because the task is most effective when pupils are basing their own work on their preconceptions or their initial thoughts. As with other draw and write tasks, this isn't an assessment of pupils' drawing skills, so if they need to, they can just draw stick figures. They may also wish to add written comments to their image to give greater clarity about the ways in which their image depicts a healthy relationship. This task comes from a lesson by Do RSE, and pupils are asked to think in a somewhat abstract way to consider how each of these diagrams might reflect a relationship of some kind. As shown in the example in the top left corner, each circle represents a person and their time, and therefore the overlap reflects the time that they're spending together and the things that they're doing. Sample answers are included in the Do RSE lesson plan, which is included within the resources, but I thought I'd share a couple of examples now. It's really helpful to prompt pupils to think beyond just romantic relationships here. The example in the top left corner might reflect two people who are in the same English class but don't spend much time together, whereas the middle image in the top row might show best friends who like to do lots of things together, or a couple who are dating but don't live together. You can then compare those ideas to the middle diagram on the bottom row, which might be a couple who live together and possibly also work together and therefore are spending loads of time together. The 3 overlapping circles in the top right corner could be 3 students who have some classes with each of the other 2, but aren't always together. Equally, it could be 2 parents and a child, or possibly even 3 siblings. From a romantic perspective, it may well represent a throuple. The bottom left image might show the blue person cheating on their partner with someone else, or it could just be that the blue person knows 2 people who don't know each other, such as a work colleague and a sibling. In the final image, in the bottom right corner, you could interpret the size of the blue circle as representing age, which might possibly make this a parent and a small child, or the circle might represent power, and therefore reflecting an unhealthy relationship where the blue person is dominant. Pupils are then asked to consider the qualities of a potential partner which they think are the most and least important. Given that the examples are listed on the worksheet, pupils can simply label each plot with the relevant letter. Encourage pupils to annotate 2 or 3 of their plots with a comment to explain their thinking, as shown in the example here. This enables pupils to formulate their arguments prior to the class discussion. The continuing template is included in the slide deck so that you can compare pupils' placement and their justifications. Depending on the nature of your class, pupils may be reluctant to share their personal viewpoints with the class, so it may be helpful to distance the conversation a little bit further by asking pupils to discuss ideas from the perspective of what they think most people might say is important or not important. This discussion about priorities in a partner then feeds into a conversation about the types of qualities which may be present in a healthy relationship and absent within an unhealthy relationship. Pupils might be able to recall conversations in their Year 7 lessons involving a boat called the relationship, which pupils annotated with similar ideas. In the activity shown here, pupils are then asked to consider how different qualities or characteristics might blur the lines between being healthy and unhealthy. Pupils should try to identify ways in which the examples, such as never having an argument, might be good for a relationship, but also how they might reflect a more problematic aspect of the relationship. The characteristics to discuss are included within the NSPCC Healthy Relationships lesson plan, which is also included with the lesson resources. Also in that NSPCC lesson plan is a scenario featuring 2 characters named Frankie and Riley. After hearing the story read out, pupils should annotate their worksheets with comments about characters' thoughts, comments and feelings, as well as what they should do next and what they should stop doing. The template is included in the slide notes so that you can gather pupil suggestions and compile responses on the whiteboard like this. The discussion element here, again, is really important, particularly as some pupils may not identify the negative behaviours which are being displayed within the relationship. The Do Now activity for Lesson 2 gives pupils a clue as to what the focus of the lesson is, although it does require them to find the 9-letter answer to this puzzle. Ultimately, this task is designed to get pupils thinking, so it's not just about finding that 9-letter word. Pupils can write their lists on a post-it note or in their exercise books, depending on whether or not you want to keep the lists afterwards. The rules are fairly simple. You can only use a letter as many times as it appears in the grid. For example, you wouldn't be able to claim the word treat because there's only one T. Each word also needs to use the centre letter, so we wouldn't be able to use the word tram either. I'd suggest giving pupils 2 or 3 minutes to create their lists and then asking each pupil for one answer as you take the register to encourage everyone to contribute at the very beginning of the lesson. Pupils further down the register may have had all of their words shared by the time you reach them, so if you continue to ask pupils for answers in this way in future lessons, you may want to adjust the order in which you ask pupils to try to make it as fair as possible. It also helps to keep them on their toes. If you haven't seen it yet, the 9-letter word is agreement, which isn't the exact focus of the lesson, but it's very close. Before explaining that the lesson focuses on consent, ask pupils to take part in an activity involving giving each other handshakes and high fives. The first time around, pupils go around in silence and have to give as many handshakes or high fives as is possible within that time frame. There's effectively no consideration for pupils to determine whether or not other people want to get involved here, although it is important to give pupils the ability to opt out by standing back from the task if they want to. Discuss pupils' reactions to the task and then ask them to do the same in round 2, but with a catch. Every decision this time needs to be discussed in detail, ranging from who initiates the handshake to how strong or hard it will be and the length of time for which it will last. After this round ends, ask pupils which attempt felt more comfortable and why. Also ask about how many handshakes or high fives they had in the second round compared to the first, as the nature of having to discuss all these things will probably mean that pupils scored fewer the second time around. Conduct a third and final round, again in silence. This time, pupils are not aiming for the most high fives or handshakes, but are instead trying to focus on the body language of other pupils to determine whether or not they want to engage. Hold a final discussion, comparing the 3 rounds, ask them which was the most comfortable and why, and possibly which of the 3 types of behaviours might be seen as socially acceptable or unacceptable, and why. This lesson explores the concept of consent. In the first round, there was no consent beyond pupils having initially agreed to participate. In the second round, consent was dialed up to the extreme, whereby everything was meant to be agreed upon. And in the third round, pupils were exploring what assumed consent might look like, by not discussing the actions, but instead responding to other people's body language. The acronym of FRIES is a really good way to help to break down the different elements of consent. It's not just a binary of yes or no, there's different aspects to consider. The legal definition of consent refers to the idea of consent being freely given, so there's no duress or compulsion to agree with whatever is being asked of an individual. If they are being forced or coerced, then this is not a consensual decision. Consent is reversible, meaning that it can be rescinded at any time, even whilst the act or procedure is occurring. For example, in a non-sexual element, parents may give consent for their child to be photographed at school, but then they might change their mind, and so the school can no longer take photos of the child. In the same way, just because someone says at one point that they want to engage in a sexual activity, that doesn't mean that they're therefore forced to follow that through. Consent should also be informed, meaning that the person knows exactly what they're agreeing to. Someone might consent to engaging in a sexual act on the basis that a condom is going to be used, but if a condom isn't used, then that is no longer consensual. It should also be enthusiastic, as in that person actually wants to do it. Linking back to the idea of consent being freely given, there's a difference between someone actively wanting to do something and then someone who is agreeing through gritted teeth. And finally, consent is specific, both to whatever is being agreed, as is highlighted with informed, but also to the time and place in which something happens. If a person agrees to a sexual act once, that should not serve as an expectation that they will be willing to engage in the same act at all other times. Discussion then turns to what consent might look like in practice. As demonstrated by the handshake activity at the start of the lesson, it's not always clear-cut. If we're saying that consent isn't always verbal, it's important to be able to identify examples of how consent may be given. Under the image of the play button, pupils will list those examples of how consent may be given. I'm going to list examples of verbal consent in the top half and non-verbal consent in the bottom half. After pupils have listed their ideas, you can discuss them as a class, trying to explore all the different ways in which a person might know that another person has agreed to something. During a sexual act, it's good to check in with the other person to ensure that the consent is still ongoing and if the other person wants to stop or to do something else. Under the pause symbol, pupils will start to list reasons for pausing and checking in with the other person, which I've listed in the top half, and examples of ways in which they could check in the bottom half. These might be specific phrases or questions which give the other person an opportunity to opt out if needed. Checking in shows respect for the other person and for their feelings and emotions, which can then make the experience more enjoyable for everyone involved. The final section considers where consent is not being given, and therefore situations in which the individual should stop what they're doing. I've listed verbal indications of consent being withdrawn at the top, but the non-verbal is the area that might be a little bit more tricky. It might also lead to questions about whether or not consent is still valid if the other person hasn't asked to stop or given any indication of wanting to stop. From a legal perspective, consent does not have to be verbal, but it must be clearly and freely given, such as through the examples listed in the play column. If we continue with the idea that the experience should be enjoyable for all involved, then there's a moral element whereby one person should recognise that the other isn't enjoying it and therefore should stop. It's also important to highlight examples where consent could clearly not be given, such as where someone is asleep, very drunk, or unconscious. Pupils will probably have many questions about consent, and they'll probably also want simple, straightforward answers. This is a point at which you need to explore those grey areas calmly and rationally with pupils, rather than just focusing on what the law says and insisting on verbal agreement. The discussion of these grey areas could be referred to as safe uncertainties, discussing the different interpretations and perspectives involved and showing pupils that not everything in life is a clear-cut right or wrong. This flowchart is included to try to help it to explore the nuance and the potential difficulties which come when discussing the practicalities of giving consent to sexual acts. In an ideal world, there would always be explicit active consent where someone is enthusiastically agreeing to the specific act being proposed. In some situations, as already discussed, this may not be conveyed verbally, but it could be considered to be active consent if the other person is actively participating and reciprocating. Passive consent can be used to describe situations where one partner doesn't stop the other from doing something, but where active consent has not been given. Legally, this does not mean that the act is consensual. The absence of no does not mean yes. It is a grey area between clear consent and clear opposition. That's why the inverted commas are around the word consent in the blue shape, because it's not actually clear whether or not that consent truly exists. Non-consent describes situations where someone is actively trying to stop the act or is rejecting a suggestion. Rape is a specific subset which legally must involve the penetration by a penis. If there is no penetration, then the act would likely be deemed to be sexual assault. Both could be examples of passive consent, where the person does not object to penetration, or non-consent, where there is clear opposition to the act. Pupils may well have lots of questions about specific incidents. As tempting as it may be to shut down the conversation and to focus just on what the law says, it's important to unpick these ideas and suggestions and to focus on whether or not there is clear consent in the situation. Pupils then have a chance to examine these safe uncertainties through different scenarios which come from the great RSE book by Alice Hoyle and Esther McGeaney. Pupils should read their assigned scenarios and then discuss whether or not they think their example is consensual. In this example, Sam is agreeing to have sex, but it sounds as though it's not enthusiastic, particularly in light of the comment about making the relationship smoother. It's also not clear as to whether Sam and Chris are male or female. Pupils may well interpret the behaviours of both characters in certain ways, and so it's worth paying close attention to the pronouns that pupils are using when referring to the characters, and then unpacking the perceptions as part of the class discussion. This lesson also features a world of work focus on the role of an intimacy coordinator. If you were filming a stunt for a TV show or a movie, you'd have a stunt coordinator. When filming sex scenes, intimacy coordinators try to ensure that actors feel comfortable and confident in what is happening and try to prevent any potentially inappropriate behaviour. There is a brief video clip linked from the slide notes, though it's important to ensure that you watch it and decide which parts you think are appropriate for your class if you're going to show it. There's also a profile that pupils can read about, which describes the role of the job. At the end of this lesson, there is an opportunity for pupils to anonymously ask questions or to make a comment about an aspect related to healthy relationships, consent, or other RSE content. It's important that each pupil in the class writes something to ensure that any questions which are written are truly anonymous. If pupils don't want to write a question, they could instead write down their favourite flavour of ice cream or tell you a joke. Writing anonymous questions helps to take away a pupil's potential anxiety about asking a question to your face, but that's not to say that they still don't want a personal response. It can be really helpful to ask them to indicate whether they want a response to the whole class, which would maintain the confidentiality about who wrote it, a one-to-one response, which would require the pupil to include their name on the slip of paper, or whether it's just a comment for your information. After the lesson, have a read through each of the responses and filter the key questions and statements from other submissions. Then plan your responses, making sure that they're age and stage appropriate, and that you've also built in time into the following lesson to share answers as appropriate. Pupils start lesson 3 by reading a short story and identifying the healthy and unhealthy behaviours they can see within the relationship. Pupils can also make notes on their worksheet to explain their ideas in preparation for the class discussion. This lesson focuses on domestic abuse, and so it's important that you give sufficient notice to any pupils who may be affected by the content of the lesson to ensure that they're not caught off guard when the class starts to discuss the term. That conversation is one which can be difficult, and so I would suggest that you show each of these 3 questions one at a time and have pupils write down their responses anonymously on a post-it note before sticking it to a wall or to the whiteboard. This allows for greater distancing, and you can then read out a summary of viewpoints rather than asking individual pupils to respond directly. After defining the term domestic abuse, pupils participate in an activity using a resource from Women's Aid. One way of approaching the task is to give each pair the handout and have them discuss their ideas before sharing suggestions as a class. Alternatively, you could read out one of the statements on the handout and then have pupils move along a continuum to show whether or not they think the situation is an example of domestic abuse. This option could be further amended by forcing pupils into the binary option of yes or no, or allowing them to stand at different points to show the extent to which they agree or disagree, which then allows for degrees of uncertainty. If you opt for the continuum model of delivery, encourage pupils to explain their reasoning to prevent them from simply following the crowd. You may also find that 5 or 6 examples is sufficient for that sort of activity, so consider which examples you think would be the most interesting to trigger the greatest debate. In both situations, hold off on providing the answers until a little bit later in the lesson, once pupils are informed of the different ways in which abuse can occur. That comes whilst watching a video explanation. Pupils should make notes on their worksheet to summarise each of the 6 types. You can then annotate the template on the slide deck to collate the descriptions and examples that pupils have been able to identify from the video. When you're playing the video, it may be helpful to pause for around 30 seconds after each of the 6 sections is explained to allow pupils enough time to finish writing down what they've heard or to add other examples that they can think of. Sometimes pupils might take quite a simplistic view of abusive relationships. They may have the idea that the victim should just leave. This data has been included in the slide deck to help to unpick the complexities of such a situation. It's important to note that this data relates specifically to partner abuse, although domestic abuse can also involve parent-to-child or child-to-parent abuse. Some aspects of domestic abuse mentioned earlier in the lesson feed directly into these reported reasons for not leaving. For example, if an abuser controls the money and has isolated the victim from their friends and family, then these will naturally lead to financial reliance and the victim having nowhere to go. Romantic relationships also involve strong emotional bonds, and a victim may be somewhat blinded by their love. Sometimes a partner will try to justify the abuse by saying it's because they love the victim, which in itself becomes another form of control, trying to stop the victim from leaving. Pupils then have time to read about these different scenarios and to use the information from their worksheet to identify the specific forms of abuse which are mentioned. Depending on the time available, you may wish to allocate specific scenarios to each pair for discussion and to then share ideas as a class afterwards. Pupils could also use examples from these scenarios to add further information to their worksheets. At the end of the lesson, pupils should go back to the story they read as part of the Do Now task and consider the red and green flags that they initially identified. Pupils may now be able to identify red flags that they'd initially not noticed, or might be able to now interpret what they thought to be green flags as now being amber or red flags. They may also find that their initial ideas have been flipped completely, and what they thought was a red flag is now actually a green flag. Lesson 4 focuses on the sending of naked and semi-naked images. Although adults might be more likely to use the term sexting, the Ofsted Review of Sexual Abuse in Schools and Colleges in 2021 found that younger people often tended to associate sexting with writing explicit messages rather than with images. It's also important that we speak the same language. In this case, you might actually find that pupils are using a different term rather than nudes. For example, they might refer to them as dick pics, and then you can agree the terminology which will be used throughout the lesson for consistency and shared understanding, in the same way that you would when discussing anatomical features where pupils don't know the correct names to be used. Throughout the lesson, a range of data from the Not Just Flirting report by Revealing Reality has been included to support discussion. In this case, the data relates to discussion prompts as to what pupils considered to be a nude. After sharing their views on what they would consider to be a nude, pupils can then see the proportion of boys and girls who reported having shared various types of images. The definition of nudes included on the slide deck comes from the government guidance to schools about intimate image sharing and clarifies that partially naked images often sit within the umbrella of nudes. You can also pick out specific data points on these slides to encourage further discussion. For example, the data shows that girls are far more likely to share images in their underwear or their swimwear, whereas boys are far more likely to send images of their genitals. You may want to ask pupils to explore potential reasons for these differences. When discussing these data points, emphasize the initial data which shows it's actually a minority of young people who are sending these images. In much the same way that other lessons explore the consequences of vaping or excessive drinking, this is designed to help to understand the issue and potential risks involved, rather than promoting or glorifying a practice. We then have a continuum task where you read out one statement at a time, and the pupils then move to designated sides of the classroom based on whether they agree or disagree with the statement. These statements have been carefully selected to ensure that they're sufficiently distanced. The only personal statement refers to generic pictures and selfies rather than to nudes. When pupils have moved to their preferred side of the classroom, select one or two pupils from both sides to explain their reasoning. This can help to reduce the number of pupils who follow others to one side or the other, and also helps to demonstrate that people may have very different opinions on the matter. You may only want to explore 3 or 4 of these statements, particularly if the comments made lead to interesting conversations or debates. And for clarity, the point of this task is to identify and discuss the different viewpoints of those within the classroom. This is not about pupils being right or wrong. The lesson also touches on sextortion, which is a growing issue, particularly for young boys. It's important to not use this information as a scare tactic, because research shows that trying to scare young people into changing their behaviour has been found to be ineffectual and even counterproductive. Instead, this is about awareness of what potentially could happen if someone shares an image with someone that they don't know, and leads into discussions about potential sources of support. Report Remove is a tool provided by Childline, the Internet Watch Foundation, and Yoti, which allows young people to report an intimate image or video which is shared online to see if it's possible to get it taken down. This video helps to explain what the process involves. Again, rather than the scare tactic of your photos will be online forever, it's much more helpful and constructive to signpost to sources of support in case things happen which pupils haven't expected. We don't tell children not to go swimming in case they drown. Instead, we teach them how to get help if they're struggling, and this is the same sort of situation. Take It Down is another platform which isn't highlighted within the lesson, although you could mention it if you feel it's appropriate. Take It Down is based in the United States, and it involves using a website to assign a unique digital fingerprint called a hash value to sexually explicit images or videos of people under the age of 18. The image does not leave the device, but the hash value is then shared with certain social media platforms and other online partners. If that image or video is then shared online, the matching hash value flags the content for review, at which point it could be removed more quickly. The same concept is available to adults in a separate website called stopncii.org. It's important to give pupils an opportunity to consider the extent to which different actions could be helpful or unhelpful, much like they would when they're completing a consequence tree task. Pupils can work individually or in pairs to read through the different pieces of advice listed on the handout and to decide which ones they think would be most and least effective in resolving a situation involving sextortion or non-consensual intimate image sharing. It's important to give sufficient time to this discussion to explore the reasons behind pupils' views and possible societal or structural changes which they feel should be made. If pupils don't think that reporting to someone on an app is effective, what should be done to make it more effective? Perhaps pupils think that changing privacy settings is something akin to victim shaming and that other people should just behave online rather than take and share images. It's also an opportunity to gauge the level of support that pupils perceive school staff can have, which may help to inform other actions which need to be undertaken across the school community. After this discussion, information from the Internet Watch Foundation and the Met Police has been summarised on a slide to inform pupils about the suggested next steps to take. Lesson 5 explores condoms and starts with a Do Now activity where pupils are asked to divide their post-it note into 3 sections. Pupils then respond to an image stimulus by writing down something that they know to be true, something they think is true, and a question they have relating to the image. Pupils can then stick all of these to the wall or the whiteboard, or leave them stuck to their table so that you can see the prior knowledge that pupils have and the questions that they would like to have answered. Pupils likely know about external condoms or male condoms, but they may not be aware of internal condoms, also known as female condoms. There is information included in the slide deck to compare the 2 types, but it would be helpful to show examples if possible too. If you have an FPA contraception kit, you should have internal condoms there, which can also be shown. The similarities and differences between internal and external condoms are also mentioned in the Year 10 RSE unit when exploring other forms of contraception. After watching a video about the process involved in making condoms, pupils have a continuum task where they must decide whether or not they think each of the statements are true. Alternatively, you could have pupils stand or sit to show their answers. The correct answers are included in the handout file, and they mention a company called My1, who offer condoms in a range of widths and lengths. The slide deck includes an image from the My1 website which shows the different widths and lengths available, but if you have time, it would be good to visit the My1 website to show pupils the Fit Kit tool, which is used to determine the appropriate length and width required by an individual. You could also discuss the cost of these items. It's around £12 for 12 custom-sized condoms compared to maybe £10 in shops for other brands. So do pupils think the additional cost is justifiable, or is it just a gimmick? That in turn might lead to a broader discussion about where young people can get condoms from. As well as buying them in shops, people can usually get them for free from sexual health clinics, and most local areas have an online service for those aged over 16, whereby a small number of condoms can be sent out in discreet packaging for free. Separate to that, there's also the Get It On scheme or C-card schemes, which run in different areas of the country. It's important that pupils have opportunities to develop their skills as well as their knowledge, and in this task, pupils are asked to select examples of excuses that one partner might give because they don't want to use a condom during a sexual act. They then need to come up with persuasive responses which could be used. For example, if someone claims they don't want to be interrupted during sex, then the other person might point out that children are very good at interrupting, and therefore that they don't want to get someone pregnant. To highlight that last answer, it's also important that pupils don't see this as a situation where the boys don't want to use condoms but girls do. That may well be the case, but it's also possible that it's the other way around, and actually it also completely ignores same-sex relationships. This task has been deliberately framed as just being about 2 people in an effort to avoid stereotyping. However, you may find that pupils make these kinds of comments which then need to be discussed and unpacked. Another practical skill focuses on the steps involved in putting on an external condom. Ideally, you would demonstrate the process step by step, and then pupils would have an opportunity to try it themselves. If this is the case, ensure that pupils are aware that they're not compelled to put on a condom, and they can simply watch others if they would prefer. Also, it would be a good idea to go around the room and ask each pupil discreetly if they want to participate, and then to only provide the ones who are going to take part with a condom to practice with. You may be able to acquire free condoms from your local sexual health clinic or through a local county council. And if your school is part of a C card or Get It On condom scheme, that might also be a good opportunity to signpost pupils to the members of staff who are involved in the relevant programme. The final lesson is focused on STIs. Near the start of the lesson, the slides have information about the different types of pathogens, and they highlight 6 particular STIs as examples. Pupils need to use that information to start to fill in this worksheet, and then as the lesson progresses, they'll have time to fill in other information as they go. There's also an adapted version of the worksheet with all the answers in boxes. Pupils could use that as a master list of answers and cross off what they write down as they put it on their worksheet, or alternatively, they could cut out the boxes and stick them into the correct spaces on the worksheet. There's actually also a practical activity in this lesson, which requires the use of some cups, some water, and ideally some lemon juice or some citric acid. It's worth speaking to your science department about what they have available and what they might be able to help you with. The task itself is described in the resource from Alice Hoyle, but in essence, pupils pour water back and forth from their cups to replicate the idea of sharing bodily fluid. What they don't know is that one of them has lemon juice or citric acid in it. And at the end of the activity, when they dip pH strips into their cups, you'll have a visual representation of how STIs can spread from one person to many. Some pupils may not wish to share their fluids at all, which is actually quite helpful in a discussion because it reinforces the idea that not engaging in sexual activity is one way to not get an STI. Equally, pupils may be confused that they've swapped fluids with someone who then turns out to have the imaginary STI, but they don't have it. That can lead to a conversation about the order in which the fluids were swapped. To help pupils to complete their worksheets, pupils will have limited time to read and summarise key information from these posters about common STIs before the posters rotate and groups receive a new example. The images on the posters are scientific stills of what the cells of an STI actually look like. It's really important to not use photos which depict the symptoms of STIs when teaching this content. Showing examples of blisters or oozing liquid links back to the point earlier about scare tactics not being effective. It's also potentially actually counterintuitive because it can give a false impression of what symptoms might look like. So many STIs have few or no visible symptoms, and although someone might feel sore or be itchy, they may then have that visual stuck in their head, which reinforces the idea that they couldn't possibly have an STI because that's not what an STI looks like. The final part of the lesson focuses specifically on HIV transmission, as HIV is the only STI listed in the RSHE statutory guidance. For this task, you'll use the Roots of HIV Transmission classroom pack from Asset UK, which is a card sort activity. Each pair will receive a set of colour-coded cards and need to find the 3 headings shown on the slide here. Pupils then need to look at the situations described on the other cards and decide whether or not those situations are likely to lead to the transmission of HIV. The classroom pack includes an answer booklet with explanations, which you can use during the class discussion once pupils have completed the task. Most of the lessons in this unit include additional resources which you can use to increase your subject knowledge or to refer to as needed, but if you're looking for further information to support your delivery of these lessons, you may find these organisations helpful. Brooke is a sexual health and wellbeing charity for young people. Their website offers a range of resources such as lesson plans, posters, fact sheets, and on-demand training, and one of those free courses within their training package focuses on consent, which may be of particular use to you before delivering the consent lesson. The Project Evolve toolkit is based on the 330 statements listed within the UK Council for Internet Safety's Education for a Connected World framework. Each of the outcomes and competencies from the framework is mapped against the range of resources within the toolkit, which includes slide decks, handouts, prompt questions, and further suggestions about lesson activities. The resources cover not only topics related to RSE, such as content and sexting, but wider content around online behaviour, such as fraud, disinformation, and managing screen time. So it's a valuable resource across the breadth of the citizenship and PSHE curriculum, and within other subject areas too. The PSHE Association is a subject association for PSHE. They provide guidance, training, and lesson resources to align with statutory RSHE requirements and beyond. Members of the PSHE Association can also access additional resources from Medway Public Health, which have been featured in various RSE units across the OAT curriculum. And finally, Thinking Before You Share is a campaign created by the Internet Watch Foundation to support discussions around sending nudes. The website has different sections for young people, parents and carers, and teachers. Each of the pages acts as a hub with signposting to videos, posters, and other websites. The teacher section also includes dedicated training and advice about discussing image sharing during lessons.